On a frozen night in the San Juan Mountains, a feared bounty hunter heard a child singing in the snow, and what he found would change his life forever. This is not just a Western tale of danger, justice, and survival. It is a story about how kindness can redeem a broken man, how knowledge can protect the innocent, and how a true home is built with courage, not money. Stay with us until the end, and if this story touches your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to support the channel.
The wind didn't just blow down from the San Juan peaks that night. It screamed. It came howling across the timberline like an old blind timber wolf looking for blood, dragging a curtain of white frost behind it. By 8 o'clock, temperature had plummeted to triple zero, the kind of dry, brittle cold that turns a man's breath to ice before it can leave his whiskers. Jesse Vance pulled his hat brim down low. His gloved hand kept a tight grip on the reins of Bay's stallion Iron. The horse was tired, his nostril muck steam. Jesse was tired too. He had spent 2 days in the valley hauling green timber for a cabin he wasn't even sure he finished building, and his bones felt like old iron left out in the rain. He didn't want anything to do with the world. He never did. A man with a 6-inch silver scar running from his jawline down to his collarbone didn't get invited to many Sunday dinners anyway. The territory called him the Vance Devil, and he let them believe it. It kept people at a distance. Distance kept a man alive. Then Iron stopped. The big stallion pinned his ears back, his hooves sinking deep into the fresh powder. He let out a low, shuddering snort and refused the nudge of Jesse's spurs. What Jesse muttered, his voice, rough from the frost, listened, above the groan of the pine branches and the shrieking gale. There wasn't a wasn't. It wasn't hostile sound. It wasn't a bobcat. It was a song, and it wasn't the wind. A child voice, trembling and brittle as glass. Jesse swung his leg over the saddle, his boots crunching heavy into saddle. He pulled his lantern from the saddle bow, the yellow wick flickering weakly against the blinding white. He followed Iron's eyes toward a massive, dying pine where the roots split above the frozen earth. Inside the hollow, buried in the snow, were 2 children. They were small, no bigger than 5 winters old. A girl with frozen golden curls was holding a dark eye tight haunted her chest. Her face was gray, her lips blue, but she kept her eyes wide open, her tiny chest heaving, as she forced out the words of the hymn. She was singing to keep her brother awake. In the high country, if a child closes their eyes in the white, they don't open them again. Jess stood froze, to face with the ugliest egulators in the territory with his pulse jumping. But the sight of those 2 small faces made his chest tighten like a rusted vice. He didn't know how to hold a child. His hands were made for iron tools and the cold steel of a colt. He dropped to knees, his heavy bearskin coat rustling in the wind. The little girl stopped singing. She looked at his scar, then at his lantern, her wide eyes reflecting the yellow flame. "Are you the bogeyman?" she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. Jesse didn't smile. He reached in, his big calloused hands thumping roughly but carefully around the boy first. The lad was completely silent, his dark eyes staring at Jesse with a terrifying, vacant stillness, the look of a creature that had already given up on being saved. "No," Jesse said, his voice flat and steady against the storm. "I'm just the man who's taking you out of the cold. Hold on to my collar. Don't close your eyes." He stripped off his bearskin coat, the only thing keeping the mountain from freezing his own blood, and wrapped it completely around the pair. He lifted them together. They weighed almost nothing. It angered him how light they were, how easily the world could just let 2 little souls drift away in the dark. Jesse walked back to Iron, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He hoisted the bundle up, setting them securely against the saddle bow. He climbed up behind them, wrapping his long arms around the bearskin mound to keep the wind from reaching them. As Iron turned his nose toward the distant lamps of Blackwood Ridge, Jesse felt a tiny, frozen hand slip out from the coat. It didn't reach for him. The little boy, Sam, reached out and pressed his bare, freezing palm right against the thick veins of Iron's neck. The horse didn't flinch. He just tossed his mane and stepped out into the blizzard, his stride long and sure. Jesse kept his eyes on the white trail, his jaw set hard. He had spent his whole life taking things from the world. Tonight, for the first time, he was bringing something back. The sun didn't rise over Blackwood Ridge the next morning, so much as it just turned the sky the color of a dirty slate shingle. The storm had passed, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh powder and a silence so heavy you could hear the timber cracking 5 miles up the ridge. Jesse Vance sat on the oak bench outside Martha's boarding house, a tin cup of black coffee warming his scarred palms. He hadn't slept. A man who spends 5 years tracking bounties across territory doesn't just close his eyes because he's got a roof over his head. Besides, his left shoulder was stiff from giving up his bearskin coat to the frost the night before. By 8 o'clock, the boardwalk began to creak. People in Blackwood Ridge didn't walk out in the street after a blizzard. They peeked through the curtains first, and what they saw was the Vance Devil sitting right on the main drag, his low slung colt resting against his thigh like a sleeping hound. The whispers started early. They ran down the timber sidewalks faster than the wind. The snow, crunched under a head, didn't lift his head. He knew the gait. It was slow, deliberate, carry weight a silver star, and carried the weight of a sill star. Sheriff 5 feet away, he's an old piece of cedar. He's huttoned by 30 years of fronty dust and bad coffee. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice in the white drift. The town's talking, Jesse, Dutton said. His voice sounded like 2 gravel bags rubbed together. They say you brought in 2 strays last night. They say you found 'em by the timberline. I found 'em, Jesse said, taking a slow pull from his cup. Folks are wondering why a man with your ledger has taken an interest in children. Jesse let his gaze drift up. His gray eyes locked on the sheriff's badge, then moved to the old man's weathered face. He didn't blink. He didn't offer a defense. The Mount don't care about a man's ledger, Sheriff, Jesse said, his tone flat as a frozen pond. It tries to kill every testes. A file SS us as an old lawman if you leave 'em hour long a tiff. That's just nature's math. Dutton shifted his weight, his hand resting on his gun belt. They have a Jesse. Clara Sterling. She has been working the kitchen back at the livery just to keep a roof over him. She is sighed now. But the talk is, those babies didn't just wander off. No, Jesse said, setting his cup down on the bench with a dull clink. They didn't. He stood up. Jesse was a full head taller than Dutton, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the snow. He didn't say another word to the lawman. He turned and walked through the pied door of the boarding house, the iron engines groaning in the cold. The parlor inside smelled of old wool, wood smoke, and grease. Martha, the widow who ran the place, was stand by the iron stove with a spatula in her hand. The moment Jesse walked in, she froze, her eyes darting to his scar, then to the floor. She didn't say morning. She just pointed her chin toward the back room. Jesse walked down the narrow hallway. The floorboards were rough sawn pine, cold against his boots. He stopped at the last door on the left. It was cracked open an inch. Inside, a woman was kneeling by the low trundle bed. Clara Sterling didn't look like the women Jesse usually saw in the territory. She didn't have the tired, hollow look of the saloon girls or the hardened, bitter stare of the ranchers' wives. Her hair was the color of autumn acorns, pinned back tight, and her gray eyes were clear. Even with the dark circles of a sleepless night bruising the skin beneath them, she was holding her boy's hand. The little girl, Abby, was sitting up in the blankets, her golden curls a tangled nest, but her cheeks had turned from gray back to a soft, healthy pink. Clara heard the floorboard creak. She didn't flinch. She stood up slow, smoothed her faded gingham apron with 2 neat strokes of her palms. It was the gesture of a schoolteacher, someone used to holding a room together with nothing but her posture. She looked at Jesse. Then she looked at the heavy ironed. He looked at Ted on his kite. You re the man, she said. It had a bell was Clary that came to shift his boots. The one brought them in, like see Vance, Slim Watkins. Taking his Jesse Vance, he said to Carly. The dis held it his stomach, they were looking betters. The doctor says their lungs are clear. So he just says their lungs are clear, Clara said. She stepped between Jesse and the bed. A protective hills. He said if they'd been out another 8. He said if they'd been out there another 20 minutes, the frost would have taken their toes. He said a man wrapped them in bearskin. The horse did the hard work, Jesse muttered. Clara looked at him closer. She wasn't looking at the scar anymore. She was looking at the way his eyes off the small desk in the corner where a Bible and 3 schoolbooks sat. Sheriff Dutton, Theos, dangerous man, Mr. Vance, she said, her voice even. Jesse gave a short, humorless grunt. The sheriff ain't wrong about most things. He told me you don't talk to folks unless there's money involved. He said you re a bounty hunter. Clara took a step toward him, her gray eyes holding his. But a bounty hunter doesn't give up his coat to 2 children he doesn't know. A dangerous man doesn't carry a boy 5 miles through a San Juan blizzards just to hand him over to an empty room. I don't like seeing things waste, Jesse said. He pulled the small brass button from his pocket, the one Sam had found in the snow, and set it on the edge of the washstand. It made a sharp metallic sound against the porcelain. Found that by the pine roots. It looks like it belongs to someone who travels with good horses. Clara looked at the button. Her fingers moved her face to her mouth of horse straight office, her shoulders trebly for second, as course she fought to rate again. Jedediah Holt, she whispered. The banker asked, my husband's family. Voice tasted honey hard as flint. They've been Surreys dropping octaves, turny hosnay. Hardly say cars say cart, or guard her old children if he has this, the law to Fergal if she est in debt. I thought if I came west, the law wouldn't reach us. I thought the frontier was big enough for a mother to just be a mother. Jesse looked down at his boots, then back at her. He knew about frontal law. He knew it was mostly written by men with high collars and big ledgers. Men who used ink to do the kind of killing a regular man used a piece of lead for. The law here ain't different, ma'am, Jesse said verbally, his voice low and steady. It just wears a wider hat. A man with a bank behind him can make the territory say whatever he wants it to say. Quien Congo human rights don't mean much to an ink pen if there ain't a piece of land or a gun to back it up. If you don't own the ground you re-standing on. The law treats you like a squatter, even if you a mother. Clara looked at the brass button, her jaw setting in a line that reminded Jesse of the granite cliffs up on the peak. Then, I just have to find some ground, she said. The front door of the boarding house banged open again, the sound echoing the narrow hall. A man's voice called out smooth, loud larynx, carrying the kind of grease that only comes from a city education. Clara. Clara, my dear, are the children safe? Jesse didn't move, but his hand found the brim of his hat again, his knuckle turning white. It belonged to the man who owned half the brick buildings in Blackwood Ridge. Jedediah Holt walked in the parlor. He was wearing a wool coat with a beaver skin collar, his boots polished so bright you could see the reflection of the wood stove in the leather. He had a round, pleasant face, the kind that made farmers think he was doing them a favor when he took their mules for interest. He stopped when he saw Jesse standing in the hallway dynamic. The smile on Holt's face didn't drop, it just froze around the edges. Like water turning to ice on a porch. Vance, Holt said, nodding once. I heard you did a turn of charity last night. The whole town's talking about it. They talk too much, Jesse said. Holt turned his back on Jesse, focusing his gaze on Clara, who had stepped out of the bedroom. He reached out to take her hand, but Clara kept her arms folded tight against her apron. Clara, the family in St. Louis is sick with worry, Holt said, his voice dripping with false syrup. This country, it's too harsh for a woman alone. Leaving the children out in a storm like that, it's proof enough that Blackwood Ridge isn't a place for a schoolmistress. I've got the stagecoach tickets right here. We can have you and the babies back in Missouri by the end of the week. The debt will be cleared and the children will have a proper home with their grandmother. Clara didn't look at the tickets. She looked at the beaver, skin collar on his coat. They didn't wander out, Jedediah, Clara said, her voice ringing clear through the quiet parlor. Someone took them from their beds while I was down in the kitchen. Someone who had a key to the back door. Holt's eyebrows went up, a look of perfect practice shock spreading across his face. Surely you don't think, Clara, the winter does strange things to a person's mind. The grief over Thomas. It's making you see ghosts. He stepped closer, his boots on the plot. Harcourt at facts, Clara. The fact is you fu a widow with no property, no income, and 2 children who almost froze to death under your watch. The territory judges aren't sent to camp for men. They see a woman who can't provide, and they see a family in Missouri with a brick house and a steady bank account. You sign the paper, and this all goes away. Jesse watched the scene from the shadow of the hallway. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He saw the way Clara Singers daw the way she didn't take a single step backward. It's not sign anything, Jedediah, he said. Holt smiled off slight. A glimpse smile finally slipped. Just a fraction. The loss of the iron teeth beneath the wolks and has 30 days to decide on the foreclosure husband state, Clara. Holt said, his voice losing its warmth. 30 days. If you can't pay the 340 $340 Thomas owed the bank, this town won't even have a boarding house room for you. Think about the children. He turned and walked out, his beaver skin coat swishing against the doorframe. Jesse stepped out of the shadow. He looked at Clara. She was pale, but her eyes were still gray fire. The little boy, Sam, had crept out of the bedroom, his bare feet silent on the floorboards. He didn't look at his mother. He walked straight to Jesse and pressed his small shoulder against the Cowboy's leather chaps. Jesse looked down at the boy. He didn't know how to comfort a child, so he just his hands rest in his gun belt. Provides and long as gob, 30 days and long in the winter, mom, Jesse said. It's long enough to build something, Mr. Vance, Clara said. The road out to the San Juan homestead wasn't a road at all. It was just a gap between the blue spruce trees where the snow flat. Jess rode iron out front, his wide chest breaking the brace thrust so Clara's mule could find a footing. Sam sat right in front of Jesse on the saddlebow, the boy's small hands tucked in the horse's coarse winter mane. They had been riding for an hour in total silence. Jesse liked the silence. The mountains didn't ask a man to spell his name. They just stood there massive and lied. Watch to see if you make a mistake. Watching to see an iron at the top a small rise. He pointed his glove can toward Valley Claw Cordally floor where a frozen walm through a grove of cottonwoods. Clara pulled her mule up beside him. "Aw grow boppy." She looked down at the valley. There was nothing there but a half-finished log cabin, its pine burs notched rough and stacked 6 feet high, looking like an open box left out in the powder. Near the creek stood 3 ancient oak trees, their black branches reaching up in the gray sky like old fingers. "It's beautiful, Jessie," she said. Her voice didn't have the schoolteacher edge now. It sounded soft, like the wind through dry grass. "It's just dirt and cold wood," Jesse muttered. He swung down from the saddle, lifting Sam down with him. The boy immediately walked over to the creek, his small boots breaking the ice crust near the edge to look at the dark water moving underneath. Jesse walked over the cabin wall, his hand running the rough bark of fresh-cut pine log. "The frost slows the sap down," he said verbally, his voice echoing in the empty valley. "If you cut a tree in the dead of winter, the timber stays straight because the cold keeps the wood from twisting while it dries. Human beings are the same way, I reckon. The hard times either straighten a person out, or they rot 'em from the inside. You find out what a man's made of when the thermometer drops below 0. Clara walked over to the stone foundation, her gloved fingers touching the mortar. "My father used to say that walls don't keep the cold out, Mr. Vance. They just keep the warmth in." "There's a difference." She looked at him, her gray eyes searched his face. He was a stone mason back in Missouri. He built 5 schools before the banks took his ledger. He always said that education was like a stone wall once you give it to a child. It don't matter how hard the winter blows, nobody can tear it down from 'em. Jesse didn't look at her. He looked at the axe sticking out of a stump near the woodpile. Her words made his throat feel tight. He thought about the 3 school books sitting on her desk back at the boarding house. He thought about the way the black ink lines on his land deed looked like a swarm of angry ants when he tried to read them. "Books keep a man warm when the wind comes off the peak." "Jesse," his tones turning no, Clara said softly, step close to him. "But they keep from being Indian who wear beaver. Yus tie a holt, yus choose a gun to take my husband's property." The Thomas didn't know how to read prop Jesse. He used a clause in a contract on a husband property that Thomas didn't know how to read properly. "Literacy isn't just a real work, Mr. Vance. It's about survival. It's about knowing where the trap is set before you step in the brush." Jesse took a deep breath of the frostbit air. He grabbed the handle of the axe, pulling it out of the oak stump with one clean jerk of his shoulder. He didn't want to talk about books. He wanted to do something that made sense, something that had weight. "The boy," Jesse said, nodding towards Sam, who was still by the creek. "Why don't he?" Clara looked over at her son, her eyes softening with a pain that Jesse knew all too well. "He hasn't said a word since the day his father died." The doctor Louis said the shock locked his throat up. He said some children just choose the silence because the world outside is too loud for 'em. "The boy ain't broken," Jesse said. He walked over to the woodpile, set a heavy cedar log on end, and brought the axe down with a sharp, rhythmic crack. The log split perfectly down the grain. "He's just waiting. A horse does the same thing when it gets caught in a barbed wire fence. It don't thrash around unless it's stupid. It just stands there, quiet-like, waiting to see if the man with the wire cutters is a friend or an enemy." The boy's just looking at the wire. Sam looked up the sounds. He didn't look afraid. He walked over to woodpile, picked up the 2 split pieces of cedar, and stacked them neat against the cabin wall. His movements were small, precise, and carried the same quiet dignity that his mother had. Clara watched them work. Jesse didn't say anything else. He just kept swinging the axe, the steady twack. thwack of the steel against timber filling the valley with a clean, honest rhythm. Every time a log split, Sam was there to catch the pieces, his small hands working along the giant S. By noon, the sun had broken through the cloud crust, turning the valley into a sheet of silver glass that hurt the eyes. Clara had built a small fire near the stone foundation, using the dry cedar chips Jesse had left behind. She was warming 3-bis kitchen. Jesse sat down on a spruce log across from her, his arms aching in a way that felt good. He took a biscuit from her hand, his rough fingers brushing against hers for just a second. Her hand was warm, despite the mountain wind. "The bank's going to take your cabin, Jesse," Clara said, her voice dropping low so Sam wouldn't hear. "Sheriff Dutton said Holt's been looking at this valley for the railroad line. He said you bought this row." Jesse tries to throw out. Jesse chewed his biscuit slow. He looked up the San Juan peaks where the snow met the blue sky, saying, "But a piece of land saying, neither am on its own ends this you drive the stake scene, I threw on hike steam. Create the stone, I drove the ski sail. They'd all steady at brain. Among those fries hold ice rowan, and it's hunts right to don runners. Is for also the crying art sorrows. Sterling, it comes from the work he puts in the ground. Holt got money, but he don't know how to hold an axe. He don't know what the soil will feel like when it freezes around your boots. A man who don't bleed for his walls don't own 'em, no matter what the paper says." Clowin blew a stray lock of her acorn-colored hair across her face, and she tucked it back behind her ear with that neat teacher's gesture. "You re a stubborn man, Jesse Vance," she said, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time since the bow. "The mountain made me that way, ma'am," Jesse said. Sam walked over from the creek holding something in his small palm. He didn't show it to his mother. He walked straight to Jessica, his dark eyes wide with a quiet curiosity. He opened his fingers. Resting in his palm was a small frozen mountain trout no bigger than a fingerling, its silver scales glistening with ice crystals. The water had frozen around it in the shallows, catching it before it could reach the deep pool. Jesse looked at the fish, then at the boy. He didn't take it from Sam's hand. He just touched the ice with the tip of his glove finger. "It's stuck, kid," Jesse said softly. "But the ice don't last forever. The spring comes back even to Colorado. You just gotta keep your gills moving until the melt hits." Sam looked at Jesse for a long moment. Then he nodded once, turned around, to set the frozen fish back in the dark water under the ice crust. Clara watched her son go, her eyes wet with something she didn't let spill over. She looked back at Jesse, and the look she gave him didn't have any distance left in it. It was the look of a person who had spent a long time looking for an honest wool in a world made of paper, and had finally found one under the mountain. The 5:00 stage from Denver didn't just bring the mail that Thursday. It brought a layer of city coal smoke and 2 men who didn't belong in the high country. Jesse Vance watched them next step from us on the slushy boardwalk from his post across the street, right outside the blacksmith forge. He didn't need to see the low, slung, grease-blackened leather of their holsters to know their trade. They had the look. It was a slouch in the shoulders, a way of keeping their backs to the wall, and eyes that moved like a pair of hunting hawks looking for a rabbit in the brush. They walked straight toward the Blackwood Ridge bank. Jedediah Holt was waiting for them at the door, his beaver skin coat open just enough to show his gold watch chain. He didn't shake their hands. A man like Holt didn't shake hands with the wolves he hired. He just pointed them toward the sheep. Jesse spat into the muddy snow. His left shoulder was still throbbing where the frost had nipped it, but his fingers were loose, hanging right above the walnut grips of his Colt. "They ain't here for cattle, Jesse," the blacksmith muttered from behind the anvil, his heavy hammer resting against the iron. "Those are city regulators, the kind that do their talking with a short barrel." "I know the breed," Jesse said. His voice was just a low rumble against the wind. "They don't like the cold. They like to finish a job quick and get back to the saloon." He didn't wait around to see them come out. He turned his boots toward the boarding house. The storm inside the town was rising faster than the one on the peaks. When Jesse reached the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, he found Clara Sterling already cornered. Holt was there, standing between the 2 city men. One of them was holding a leather ledger under his arm, while the other kept his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes fixed on Clara's face. Abby and Sam were tucked tight behind their mother's skirts, Abby's small fingers bunching the faded gingham till her knuckles were white. It's a matter of the territory statute, Clara, Holt was saying, his voice carrying that loud, smooth ring that made the storekeeper look out the window. The probate judge in Denver signed the decree. A Goafua widow without a registered homestead or an annual income of $200 cannot exercise legal guardianship over minors in a frontier district. The law is plain. It's meant to protect the children from vagrancy. Clara stood sung. Her chin lifted so high, her bonnet fell back against her shoulders. She didn't look at the city men. She looked straight into Holt's eyes. The law didn't write those words to protect my children, Jedediah, she said, her voice striking the cold air like a brass bell. You wrote them with your ink, well, so you could hand my babies over to a family that will raise them to forget their father's name. You call it faply legal process. It's just a high-toned way of stealing a woman's life because she don't have a husband's name on a piece of paper. Quinthuso personal liberty don't belong only to the men who own the banks. The enforcer with the ledger took a step forward, his boot heavy on the boardwalk. He had a face like old lard. We ain't here to argue the school books, lady. We got the Marshal S. seal right here. You signed the waiver of custody. Or we take the boy and the girl on the morning stage. The law don't require your permission if you re a dependent. He reached out his hand, his thick fingers grabbing at Clara's arm to pull her aside. He didn't run. His way, his walk in the light, his big framed canons on the stone, barforts on his larns, his arm was hang his gun. But his arm on straight, his hard inch. Froze, his shoulder away from Quipe. The second city man took hands out of his pockets, came out his coat. The so-quats hits the Bristol Drawford's elbow for hot sable, who had border watted stopped. Nobody breathed, gray eyes locking onto the second man's hand. The boardwalk narrowed today. Harry, there were no hard lodges, said. Our stomatrop if he get her to mountain ice. Vance slips rees if he used to the mountain ice. Vance, his voice docket sart. But the children's concern, obeyed this. The children ought to are ugly. The guest are ugly laughed. Faceman let out a shortly. You want to try your luck against 2 city warrants. Outlaw says she sent fit before Jesse could answer. Before the second man could drop his hand to his holster, a small shadow moved from behind Clara's apron. It was Sam. The little boy didn't look at his mother, and he didn't look at Jesse. He stepped right in the space between Jesse's boots and the enforcer's gun. He planted his small leather shoes in the slush, his chest heaving under his wool coat. He looked straight up in the lard-faced man's eyes. "Don't you shoot him," Sam shouted. The words didn't come out as a whimper. They came out as a roar, a breaking sound that cracked through the wind air like a rifle shot. Thus, Lard smacked back a full foot, his heels catching on the dry goods threshold. The second man's hand froze right above his leather holster, his eyes widening in sheer surprise. Clara dropped to her knees in the snow, her hands going to her mouth as a hards tore out of her throat, her fold Sam against her chest, her face buried in his dark hair. The boy didn't cry. He kept his eyes fixed on the enforcers, his tiny fist bunching up the fabric of his mother's coat. Jesse didn't look down. He kept his gaze on the city men until the second guy let his hand drop completely away from his gun belt. The boy spoke, Jesse said, his tone low and dangerous. I reckon that means he's fit enough to choose his friends. You tell the judge in Denver that the Vance devil is keeping an eye on this particular ledger. Holt didn't say another word. He turned his back, his beaver-skin coat swishing through the slush as he walked back toward the bank, the 2 hired guns following him like beaten dogs. Jesse knelt down in the snow beside Clara. He didn't touch her, but he reached out and placed his big palm over Sam's small shaking shoulder. You got a big voice for a short cowboy kid, Jesse said. Sam looked at him, his dark eyes clear and steady. He didn't say anything else, but he reached out and took hold of Jesse's thumb, his small fingers wrapping around the scarred skin like a vice. Clara looked up at Jesse through her tears, her face pale but her eyes full of gray fire. He hasn't spoken a word since the graveyard, Lewis, Jesse. Not one word. He was just saving his breath for when it mattered, ma'am, Jesse said verbally, his voice softening just a fraction. That's what a smart creature does. Human beings spend too much time talking when the weather is fair. They waste their words on things that don't have weight. But a boy who knows the cold, he waits until the iron's hot before he strikes. That's just good sense. He stood up, lifting his hat to her before he turned back toward the timberline. The sun was setting behind the peaks now, throwing long purple shadows across the valley. But for the first time in 25 years, Jesse Vance didn't feel the cold in his bones. The moon over Blackwood Ridge that night was sharp enough to cut wood. Jesse Vance didn't use a lantern when he walked in the livery stable behind the bank. He didn't need one. He knew the smell of the Sterling family horse smelled of sweet grain and expensive leather oil from St. Louis, a smell that didn't belong in a territory where most mules lived on dry bunch grass. Doyle Sterling was sitting on a grain sack in the back stall, a bottle of rye whiskey between his boots. He was Clara's brother-in-law, a small, soft-faced man who had come west with Holt to take the twins. When the stable door creaked, Doyle reached for a small pocket pistol in his vest. Jesse's boot hit his wrist before it could clear the cloth. The pistol clattered in the straw. Jesse reached down, his big hand grabbing Doyle by the wool collar of his coat and hoisting him until the man's heels were dangling 6 inches off the dirt floor. He slammed him back against the pine partition wall, the dry timber groaning under weight. Wait, Jesse, don't!" Doyle choked out, his face turning the color of wood ash. "It wasn't my doing, I swear to God." Jesse didn't pull his Colt. He reached in his pocket and pulled out the brass button Sam had found under the dying pine. He pressed the sharp of the metals right into the soft skin beneath Doyle's ear until a tiny bead of dark blood appeared. "You left him," Jesse said. His voice was just a whisper, but it sounded like grease dropping into a hot skillet. 5 winters old. And a 30-old lady. Doyle gasped, his hands clawing at Jesse's iron wrists. "Margaret! Thomas' mother! She hired the men to do it. She didn't want him dead, Jesse. I swear on my mother's grave." Jesse didn't loosen his grip. "Talk." "She wanted him found," Doyle whispered, his breath coming in ragged, whiskey-soaked bursts. "She knew Clara was working the kitchen, that she didn't have a cent to her name. Margaret figured if the children were found wandering the timberline, the territory court would declare Clara negligent. It was the only way to get the twins back to St. Louis legally. The law doesn't allow a go-off for a widow to keep her family if she's proven unfit by the community. They were supposed to be picked up within an hour. We didn't know the blizzard was going to hit early." Jesse looked at the man's wet, terrified eyes. He felt a deep, cold disgust rise up in his chest. An old anger from his own childhood in the cattle camps, where the strong always used the law to break the weak. He dropped Doyle in the straw like a sack of turnips. "You stay here until the morning train," Jesse said flatly. "If I see your face on the boardwalk when the sun comes up, I show you what a San Juan winter does to a man's bones." He walked out in the cold night, his long strides carrying him back to the boarding-house parlor. Clara was sitting by the stove, her apron off, her hands busy knitting a gray wool sock for Sam. The boy was asleep on the trundle bed, his dark hair damp from the wash basin. When Jesse walked in, she looked up, her gray eyes taking in the snow on his boots and the hard line of his jaw. Jesse stood by the door, his hat, his hands. He had told what Doyle had said. He didn't soften the words, and he didn't look away from her face while he spoke. Clara Esniel stopped moving. She sat perfect still for a full minute, seeing the room being the low strum of the wood stove. Then she laid the low thrum of the wood stove. Then she laid the wool down on the table, her hands flat against the grain. "The fact is a terrible thing, Mr. Vance," said wool odds. She said word to it. Her voice didn't shake, but it had a cold crystalline hardness to it that Jesse had never heard before. "My mother-in-law thought she was doing God's work. She thought because she had a brick house and a servant in the kitchen, her love was worth more than mine. She used the name of family to turn my babies into a piece of legal evidence. She almost froze them to death just to prove she was right." She stood up, walking over to the trundle bed to look down at Sam's sleeping face. "Trek Nyun Van Hume responsibility starts with seeing another person as a whole creature, Jesse," she continued, her voice softening as she touched the boy's hair. "Not as a dependent, and not as a piece of property to be traded for a cleared ledger. If a mother's right to love her children is based on how much money she has in the bank, then the frontier ain't free at all. It's just an extension of the same old cage we left behind in Missouri." Jesse watched her from the doorway. He didn't have the school words to tell her she was right, but his action spoke for him. He stepped over to the woodbox by the stove, picked up 3 heavy split logs of oak and laid them in the fire, box one by one, ensuring the room would stay warm until the dawn. "Doyle's leaving on the morning stage," Jesse said. "Let him go," Clara said, her eyes still on her boy. "He's just the hand that pushed them. The heart that thought of it is far away from here. But they didn't reckon on one thing, Mr. Vance." "What's that?" Clara turned around, looking straight at him, her gray fire catching the light from the stove. They didn't reckon on a dangerous cowboy being out on that ridge. They thought the world was full of men like Jedediah Holt, men who look a ledger before they look a soul. They didn't know you were out there. Jesse shifted his boots, his face turning red under his dark beard. He wasn't used to a woman looking at him like he was something worth keeping. He picked up his hat, his thumb running along the leather band. "The horse knew the way, ma'am," he muttered, turning his back to door. "The horse didn't make the promise, Jesse," Clara said softly to his back. Jesse walked out in the frozen street, the snow crunching under his boots with a steady, determined rhythm. He looked up at the mountains, where the dark pines stood like soldiers against the white peaks. The Sterling family had the money, and they had the judges in Denver, but Jesse faced the timber under his hands, and he had a boy who had broken his silence to save him. He knew which ledger had more weight. The road out to the San Juan homestead wasn't a road at all anymore. It was just a gap between the heavy loose spruce trees where the snow lay flat and clean. Jesse Vance rode Arvant's, his wide chest all crust so Clara's mule could find a footing. Sam sat right in front of Jesse on the saddlebow, his small hands tucked in the horse's coarse winter mane. Had her arm wrapped around Wyatt's like a cinch. They'd been riding for an hour in total silence. The silence. Jesse liked the silence, and they didn't care if he had some man to spell his name. Dassie the glass in at the lists to be lied, watching to see if you make a this, Jess. Rind iron. The doff a small rye. The way it slug was slowly in at the top of a small rye, the grove of cottonwood, where Fosen Creek wound through a grove of cottonwoods. "That's it," Jesse said. Clara pulled her mule up beside him. She looked down at the valley. There was nothing there but a half-finished log cabin, its pine timbers notched rough and stacked 6 feet high, looking like an open box left out in the powder. Near the creek stood 3 ancient oak trees, their black branches reaching up the gray sky like fingers. "It's beautiful, Jesse," she said. Her voice didn't have the schoolteacher edge now. It sounded soft, like the wind through dry grass. "It's just dirt and cold wood," Jesse muttered. He swung down from the saddle, lifting Sam down with him. The boy immediately walked over to the creek, his small boots breaking ice crust near the edge to look the dark water move underneath. Jesse walked over to cabin wall, his hand running along the rough bark of a fresh, cut pine log. "The frost slows the sap down," he said verbally, his voice echoing in the empty valley. "If you cut a tree in the dead of winter, the stays straight because the cold the wood from staying while it dries. Human beings are the same way, I reckon. The hard times either straighten a person out or they rot him from the side. You find out what a man's made of when the thermometer drops below zero." Clara walked over to the stone foundation, her gloved fingers touching the mortar. She froze. Her eyes moved from the mortar to the alignment of the base stones, then to the 3 ancient oaks by the water. Her breath hitched, coming out in a sharp cloud of white steam. "This foundation," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jesse, where did you get the deed to this parcel?" "Bought it off the Territorial Land Office in Durango," Jesse said, pulling his leather gloves tighter. "It was an old foreclosure. Belonged to a man who couldn't pay his taxes after the panic of 7-3. Clara turned round slow. Her gray eyes were wide, staring as if he were a ghost stand in the snow. "This was my father's land," she said. The wind died down for a second, leaving a heavy, dead quiet between them. Henry retracing the edge of cornerstone. "He didn't lose a tax, Jesse." Her fingers traced a Jedediah cornerstone. "He didn't lose it to taxes, Jesse. He lost it to Jedediah Holt's bank. My father was a stone mason. He designed the house to sit right here, so the oaks would block the north wind in January. When Holt took the ledger, my father's heart just broke. He died 6 months later in a rented room in Missouri." Jesse looked down at his boots, then at the rough, cut logs he had spent 3 months hauling. The truest irony of the frontier was staring him right in the face. He had bought this land legally with his own blood, money from bounty hunting, but he was standing on the grave of her family's dream. "I didn't know his name," Jesse said, his voice dropping in his chest. "If I had known." "No," Clara interrupted, stepping across the snow toward him. She placed her gloved hand on his rough leather sleeve. "Don't say that, Jesse. Quinsahoot property rights on the frontier are a messy business. The banks use the law like a skinning knife, taking from the men who sweat and giving to the men who sit in brick offices. But the soil don't care about the name written in the courthouse ledger. It only knows the man who drives the plow. My father lost this land because the law didn't protect a poor man's labor, but you bought it with your own blood and sweat. If someone is going to build a life here, I want it to be a man who knows what the wood feels like when it freezes. Jesse looked at her hand on his sleeve. He felt a strange warmth rise up through his coat, a feeling that had nothing to do with the midday sun. I built it for a family, Jesse said, looking over at Sam and Abby, who were now building a small fortress out of dry pine branches near the creek. I didn't have one myself. I thought maybe this ground could hold something real. It can, Clara said softly. But a house needs more than walls, Jesse. It needs a purpose. It needs to be a place where the truth is told. She looked at him, her gray eyes holding his until he had to look away toward the peaks. Jesse grabbed his spade from the saddle, his arm working with a sudden, fierce energy to clear the snow from the cabin's interior floor. He didn't want to talk about deeds anymore. He wanted to do something that had weight, something that proved he wasn't the devil the territory said he was. By noon, Clara had built a small fire near the foundation, using the dry cedar chips Jesse had left behind. She warmed 3 biscuits from Martha's kitchen on a flat stone. Jesse sat across from her on a spruce log, his shoulder muscles aching in a way that felt honest. Holt won't let you keep it, Jesse, Clara said, her voice low so the children wouldn't hear. He knows my father's land is worth 5 times what you paid for it now that the Union Pacific is surveying the canyon route. He'll use the territory marshals to find a flaw in your homestead filing. Jesse chewed his biscuit slow. He looked at the granite cliffs where the timberline ended. A man's right to his own life, his freedom ain't something that comes from a judge in Denver, Mrs. Sterling, Jesse said verbally, his voice deep and steady. It comes from the work he puts in the ground. Holt has got money, but he don't know how to hold an axe. He don't know what the soil feels like when it frees around your boots. A man who don't bleed for his walls don't own 'em, no matter what the paper says. We hold the line right here. Clara looked at him for a long time, the gray fire in her eyes catching the reflection of the wood sparks. Then we hold it together, Mr. Vance, she said. The office of the Blackwood Gazette smelled of stale ink, tobacco, and vinegar. It was a low-ceiling shack at the end of the alley behind the livery stable, where the floorboards were permanently stained black from the printing press. Jesse Vance had to duck his head clear the doorframe when he walked in that Friday evening. Clara followed him, holding a leather folder under her arm. Sam Reeves, the editor, was sitting on a high stool with a green eye shade pulling his rear back. He was 26, thin as a lodgepole pine, and had just arrived from Denver 3 months ago with a crate of type, metal, and a heart full of dangerous ideas about the truth. Vance, Reeves said, not looking up from his proof sheet. I told you before, I don't print advertisements for bounty hunters. This paper is for the advancement of the district. We ain't here to advertise, Jesse said. He dropped his heavy hand onto the editor's desk, the wood groaning under the impact. We're here to look at the ledger from 75. Reeves stopped his ink pen. He looked at Jesse Ascar, then at Clara, who was already setting her folder down on the ink-stained table. The editor's eyes sharpened. The year of the Durango killing, Reeves muttered, swinging his legs off the stool. The terrorists settled that 3 years ago. Every corporal, every paper from here to Missouri River called you the Vance Devil. The papers lied, Clara said, her voice clear as ice. She opened her folder, pulling out 3 cedar-flown sheets of official Terrell Durango. Mr. Reeves, a certified board you a land appraisal from Durango. That these dates, model how to sauce and a chaos fault towards tround, all the Yule lights delays. Hador Carl Tool Tordos, hold the yellow date but top. Clara stood before to the black ink lines. In August of 1875, Clara said verbally, her voice dropping into that steady rhythmic cadence she used when she wanted a lesson to stick. The Durango paper published a front-page story stating that Jesse Vance had shot a homesteader named Carter Webb over cattle dispute. But look at the land registry for that exact same week. Carter Webb didn't own cattle. He owned a way section that the bank under Jedediah Holt was trying to acquire for the railroad. And look at the witness signatures on the sheriff's report. They re all employees of the Blackwood Ridge Bank. Reeves stared at the names, his brow furrowing as he did the math in his head. They framed him, the editor whispered, looking up at Jesse. They used your reputation as a bounty hunter, Jesse. You were already known as a man who brought folks in dead or alive. If the town thought you Webb over Wolf Alder, nobody would look at the railroad deeds. They used your name to cover a murder. They need a monster, Mr. Reeves, Clara continued, her eyes holding the editor S. Dinkin Sahoy social prejudice is a power tool for a corrupt man. If you make the community hate a man enough, they won't even look at the evidence. They accept the lie because it fits the story they've already been told. That's how a man like Holt stays clean while his hands are full of blood. He lets the territory Joe is hanging for him. Jesse stood in the corner of the dark shack, his arms folded across his chest. Hearing her say the words out loud made something in his throat feel tight. For 3 years, he had carried that name like a heavy iron pack. He had stopped looking people in the eye because he knew they only saw the monster the Durango Herald had printed. A schoolmistress with no gun and no money, stripping the lie away with nothing but her intelligence and a few pieces of paper. "Can you print it?" Jesse asked, his voice low. Reeves looked at the printing press in the corner, then back at the deeds. A slow, reckless smile spread his thin face. "My father didn't send me the University of Ohio to print grocery list for Jedediah Holt Vance. If you can give me one more witness to tie Holt directly to the bribes. He run this story on the front page of the Wednesday edition. We'll see how his beaver skin coat looks inside a territory jail." "I get you the witness," Jesse said. They walked out in the cool night air. The street was quiet, the moon casting long, blue shadows across the snowdrifts. Clara was shivering slightly, her breath coming in short puffs. Jesse stopped beneath the awning of the dry goods store, turned his back to the wind, and looked down at her. "You shouldn't have done that," Jesse said rough-like. "If Holt finds out you redigging in the Durango business, he won't just use the marshals. He send men who don't care about school books." Clara looked up at him, her gray eyes dark with a determination that made him feel small. "He's already sent them, Jesse," she said. "He sent them into my children's bedroom in the dark. He has been using the law to starve us out because he thinks a woman alone don't have the teeth to fight back. But he forgot that the truth don't need a husband to stand up in court. It just needs a voice." She took a step closer to him, her hand touching his sleeve again. "I didn't do it just for my father's land, Jesse. I did it for you. A man shouldn't have to live his life in the dark because some banker decided his name was convenient for a lie. You saved my babies from the white, Jesse Vance. The least I can do is save your name from the black." Jesse didn't know what to say. His whole life had been about survival, about finding the dry cave, about keeping his powder dry, about striking first before the other man could lift his barrel. Nobody had ever talked about saving him before. He reached up, his big, rough thumb gently touching the edge of her woolen bonnet where the frost had gathered. "The Wednesday stage is going to be loud, Clara," he said softly, using her name for the first time. "Then we just have to speak louder, Jesse," she said. They walked back toward the boarding house, their boots making a clean, synchronous crunch in the freeze to his snow. Jess, his eyes moving over every dark alleyway and every dark arraign, barrels. He was still the Vance devil to the town, but as he looked at the woman walking beside him, he just had to finish burying it. The walls of the cabin under the San Juan peaks were 8 logs high now. The fresh pines smelled sharp and sweet, a clean scent that cut through the bitter, stale smell of the mountain frost. Jesse Vance worked until his shirt was soaked through with sweat, despite the thermometer hovering near single digits. He liked the bite of the adze. He liked the clean, pale curls of wood that fell around his heavy leather boots. By 3 in the afternoon, Clara Sterling had driven her mule up the rise. She brought the twins. Abby was already wrapped in an old woolen shawl, her fingers holding a piece of charcoal she'd found near the hearth. Sam didn't run. He walked slow, his dark eyes fixed on the way Jesse dropped the heavy cedar rafters into their notched grooves. The boy didn't speak another word after that day on the boardwalk, but his silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of a trapped creature. It was the quiet of a builder measuring the timber. Clara walked in the center of the roofless cabin. Her long gray skirts sweeping from the formal floor, she pulled a folded piece of parchment from her sleeve, the new land registry certificate Sam Reeves had smuggled out of the land office. "It needs your mark, Jesse," she said. Her voice had that quiet, steady hum of the schoolroom. "The land marshal needs the signature before the territorial circuit closes on Friday." Jesse stopped his ass. His arm went stiff. He stared down at the white parchment in her hand, the black ink lines crossing over each other like a tangle of dry briars in a draw. His chest tightened, a hard, cold knot forming right beneath his ribs. It was the old shame. The shame that had kept him out of the towns and away from the lamps since he was 8 years old. He didn't take the paper. He turned his back to her, picking up his whetstone and drawing it slow across the steel blade of his tool. Slick, slick, slick. The sound was the own it later, Jesse said, his voice dropping low in his beard. The sun's going down. A light's going down. Light's tur didn't move. She didn't let the paper drop. Slots bunch mus in his neck, the way his thumb kept pressing against the dull side of the blade until the skin turned white. She had seen that exact looker house in her schoolhouse in Missouri. It was the look of a boy who had been for real he would solve. The light's fine, Jesse, she said soft. The light's are keen. Aisle slantry. We said slawed his shadow, his shoes, crunching on the pine shavings. The letters stand still for you, do they? Jesse froze. He didn't turn around. He felt the silver scar on his neck turn hot under his collar. I can read a trail, he muttered, his jaw clamped tight. I can read the clouds before the ice hits the pass. I know you can, Clara said. Her voice was right at his shoulder now. But the black ink on the white page, it looks like a swarm of locusts. The words twist and be swine to find the bidding a line. Your brain don't see the shapes the way the city men do. Jesse swung around, his gray eyes dark with an old dangerous fire. He looked like he wanted to reach for his Colt, but his hands were empty, his fingers trembling just a fraction against the handle of the adze. Miss Sterling, he rasped. The territory devil ga homload a jat to gay thoughts startle what who knows hobs haka hars knows his stare. Jesse sir also stoporied. She reached out and placed small Bian right over the scar on his jaw. Her finger or the scar on his jaw. Her finger bit lep nurik karste. Sukak bit the scholars buttons call it, what Ingerswam says colds call it. It don't mean a man is foolish. It means his mind was built to read the tracks in the forest instead of the print in a ledger. You aren't slow. You were just never taught to see the alphabet through the hands instead of the eyes. A boy who lose his folks at 8 don't get a desk. He gets the whip. Jesse looked down at her. The anger in his chest didn't break. It just dissolved, leaving behind a hollow, aching space that had been there for 25 years. No one had ever given a name to his darkness before. They had just called him lazy in the camps, or crazy in the saloons. I can't sign it, Clara, he whispered. She turned over a flat pine wrap, the piece of charcoal from Abby's stumps. She took piece of charcoal from Abby's hand. With 3 board heavy wood, she drew a large shape in the gray the wood. That S a valley, Jesse, bar. That S the charcoal line. Verbally pointing to the charcoal line. Think like the draw between the 2 San Juan peaks. That's the letter J. Run your thumb along the groove where the wood splits. He dropped his ass in the dirt. He brought his mask-scarred thumb down onto the pine log. The charcoal got under his fingers on. The charcoal got under his fingernail, dry and gritty. He felt the curve of it. He felt where the line stopped. Now do the V, Clara said, drawing a sharp valley right next to it. That's the mountain pass where you found my babies. It's S-A-V. Jesse traced the second shape. He did it slow, his breathing heavy in the quiet valley. For the first time in his life, the letters didn't jump. They stayed right there, locked in the grain of the pine log where his hands could find them. That's your name, Jesse Vance, Clara said, her voice dropping into a rhythmic cadence that sounded like a song. Fung Fap Tuk Hang kinesthetic learning is how a man like you conquers the ink. If you can't read the paper with your eyes, you carve the words in your memory with your muscles. The mind learns through the skin just as fast as it does through the ear. Jesse didn't say anything. He knelt there by the log for a long time, his big hand covering the 2 letters he just touched. Abby came over and sat beside him, her small charcoal, stained fingers tracing the same lines right under his thumb. Sam stood by the horse, his dark eyes watching the 3 of them with a steady, quiet understanding. That evening, the fire in the cabin hearth was the only light in the whole Tung Lung. Jesse didn't pick his whetstone. He sat on a 3-legged stool by the oil lamp, a flat piece of cedar on his knees. Clara sat beside him, her finger guided his hand as he drew the charcoal across the wood, over and over, until the shapes felt as natural to his arm as the swing of a regular axe. You redoing it, Jesse, she whispered. Jesse looked at the word he'd written on the cedar block, H-O-M-E. He could feel the 4 corners of the house in the lines. He looked up at Clara, his gray eyes clear in the yellow lamplight. Thank you, he said. The word was short, but it carried the weight of the 25 winters he'd spent in the dark. The Wednesday edition of the Blackwood Gazette hadn't been on the boardwalk for 2 hours before the wind changed. Jesse Vance stood in the shadow of the livery awning, his wool coat buttoned up to his chin. The town was quiet, too quiet. The farmers who usually stood around the flour scales at the dry goods store were gone. The only sound was the rhythmic thump of the printing press down the alley, where Sam Reeves was already running off a second batch of sheets for the Denver stage. The front page didn't mince words. Reeves had set the type in the largest bold face he had. Though the Vance reputation was manufactured to cover a railroad land grab, the Jess saw Jedediah Holt come out of the bank. The banker wasn't wearing his beaver skin coat today. He had on a plain black wool traveling coat, and he was carrying a small leather valise pinned tight under his arm. He didn't look at the boardwalk. He looked down at his polished boots as he walked toward the telegraph office at the depot. A horseman trotted past Jesse, his mount lathered with white foam despite the cold. It was one of Sheriff Dutton's deputies. He didn't stop at the jail. He rode straight toward the boarding house. Jesse's hand dropped instinctively to his side, his fingers wrapping around the cold walnut grip of his Colt. His instincts, the old bounty hunter wiring that had kept him breathing through 3 territory wars, told him the air was thick with lead before the first shot was even fired. He broke into a trot, his heavy boots throwing up chunks of gray slush. He found Clara in the back parlor of the boarding house, her trunk open on the floor. She was packing the 3 school books and her husband's old surveyor's compass. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady as she wrapped the brass instruments in a flannel shirt. "The deputy just came by, Jesse," she said, her voice dropping into that quick, rhythmic beat. "He said a rider from Durango just brought word. Holt didn't just hire regulators to threaten us. He sent a telegram to Denver on Monday. He's brought in 2 executioners, the Miller brothers." Jesse felt his jaw go hard as granite. He knew the Millers. They weren't lawmen, and they weren't regular cowboys. They were dry gulchers, men who took contracts from the big cattle syndicates to clear out homesteaders. They didn't shoot a man in the street. They waited in the timber until he went to the well for water. "You need to take the twins and get on the southbound buckboard," Jesse said, his voice flat. "Dutton can keep them at the jail until the stage leaves." "No," Clara said. She stood up straight, her gray eyes locking onto his with a fierce, uncompromising fire. "I'm not running into the timber, Jesse. My husband Tommins didn't die of consumption, just so I spent the rest of my life dodging Holt's hired guns in the dark." She walked over to the small table, lifting a tin box that sat beneath her sewing basket. She pulled out a thick envelope tied with a red string. "This is what they re-hunting," she said verbally, her voice striking the room like iron on iron. "Thomas was a surveyor for the Union Pacific before he took sick. He kept a duplicate ledger of the land coordinates through the San Juan Canyon. This envelope contains the proof that Holt's bank didn't buy those sections. They altered the territory charts after the owners died. Quien comes in can't civil rights if a citizen can't use the evidence to defend his own ground before a grand jury. If I run now, that ledger appears into Holt's stove, and every homesteader from Harta Durango becomes a tenant on his own land." Jesse looked at the envelope, then at the window where the gray mountain light was fading fast. He saw her point. He saw it clearer than ever seen any trail in the high country. She was fighting for something bigger than a cabin or a parcel of dirt. She was fighting for the rule of the line itself. "The Millers won't care about the ledger, Clara," Jesse said. "They'll just clear the house. Then we'll make sure the house is guarded," she said. Jesse took a slow, deep breath, his thumb tracing the leather of his gun belt. He didn't try to argue with her. He respected her too much for that. A woman who had carried her babies through a 30-mile blizzard wasn't going to be scared off by 2 dry gulchers from Denver. "Dutton's standing with us," Jesse said. "I saw him loading his Winchester at the jail. But the Millers will come from the timber behind the creek. They like the shadow. Then that's where we wait for them," Clara said. By 6 o'clock, the valley under the San Juan peaks was completely dark. The moon hadn't risen yet, leaving the half-finished cabin looking like a black silhouette against the white snowfields. Jesse had moved Clara and the twins in the small root cellar beneath the stone foundation, the only part of the house that had a full oak roof over it. Jesse sat on a spruce log near open doorway, his Winchester resting across knees. He didn't have a lantern lit. Every crack of the ice on the creek, every groan of the ancient oak trees on the wind, a round of the ancient oak trees on the lean. Around midnight, Iron gave a low, barely audible snort of logs. Jesse's ears pinned back. He didn't lift Yuri's pin back. He didn't lift his rifle yet. He watched the white line of the snow where the cottonwoods met the clearing. 2 shadows broke from the trees. They didn't have horses. They had left them down the draw to keep the shoes from clanking against the stones. They were moving low, their heavy wool coats bundled tight, their long, barreled rifles held across their stomachs. Jesse stood up, his boots same of the dirt floor. He stepped in the frame of the doorway, his silhouette wide and unmistakable against the pale snow behind him. "The valley's closed for the winter, boys," Jesse called out. His voice wasn't loud, but it had that dry, rasping crack that stopped both shadows dead in their tracks. The man on the left didn't check his ledger. He brought his rifle up in one smooth, practiced motion. A flash of orange fire ripped through the dark. The lead ball tore through the pine casing an inch from Jesse's ear, showering his face with sharp wood splinters. Jesse didn't flinch. He dropped to one knee, his Winchester coming up to his shoulder with a rhythmic, mechanical precision he'd practiced for 10 years. Crack! The rifle kicked hard against his shoulder. The shadow on the left let out a short, wet grunt and dropped his rifle into the snow, his hands going to his thigh as he fell backward into the drift. The second man, the older Miller brother, dived behind Stow-Foundawall, his short, barreled shotgun roaring twice in the dark. The buckshot peppered the heavy pine logs above Jesse said, chewing the bark into dust. "Vance," Miller shouted from behind the stone. "Holt's already on the train to Denver. You re-fighting for a dead ledger. Give us the woman and the papers, and you can keep the dirt." Jesse didn't answer with words. He shifted his position, his boots clearing a patch of pine curls as he moved toward the flank of the stone wall. From the root cellar hatch behind him, he heard a sound, the low, steady hum of Abby sing her hymn in the dark. She was keeping Sam quiet. Then a second shot echoed from the top of the rise. It wasn't a rifle. It was the sharp metallic bark of Dutton's old 10-gauge shotgun. The sheriff had come down the gulch behind them. Miller didn't wait to see how many deputies were with the old man. He fired one wild shot in the dark cabin and broke for timber, his boots floundering deep in the fresh drifts. As Dutton's men closed the circle from the road, the valley went quiet again. The smoke from the black powder drifted slow through the rafters. Smell of sulfur and burnt grease. Jesse stood by the log wall, his left arm feeling numb. He looked down in the faint starlight and saw a dark stain spread across the wool sleeve of his coat where a piece of buckshot had grazed the flesh. It was deep, but it burned like him. The hatch door creaked open and unlit. Clara came out first. Her lantern arced the timber line, and she didn't look at the sheriff's arm riding down the hills. She walked at the sheriff's arm with a tight fingers, craned his left arm arca swelling. Sus, schwot sarkets vors a busser assars verbaliens, it's just a scratch from the wugs. The bark, Clara, his voice steady as he set his rifle down against the logs. The bone is whole. The lead didn't stay in. She pulled her handkerchief from her sleeve, went it tight around his forearm with 2 quick professional knots. She didn't weep and her hand didn't shake. "The ledger is safe, Jesse," she said, her voice dropping in that quiet rhythm. Dutton S. got Holt's telegrams from the station. The law has to look the chain of title now. Jesse looked down at her face, his gray eye softness, as he felt the warmth of her fingers against his skin. The Miller brothers were broken, and Holt was running from his own ledger. But as Jesse looked around the roofless cabin, he knew the truest victory was right there in the dirt floor. They hadn't just held the ground. They had held the line for every poor soul who didn't know how to fight the ink. "We finish the roof tomorrow, Clara," Jesse said softly. "Yes, we will, Jesse," she said. The snow didn't melt all at once that March. It went slow. It gave way under a warm wake when that blew down from high Hans, turning the white crust into gray slush first, then into clear, rushing water that filled the draws and made the black soil under the cottonwood smell of wet earth and old pine needles. Jesse Vance stood on the porch of the finished cabin, a dry rag in his hand as he rubbed down Iron's winter coat. The stallion was shedding his heavy hair in big gray clumps, his skin twitching on the rough canvas. The valley was different now. The open box of pine logs had a tight roof of cedar shingles over it, and the stone foundation that Henry Whitmore had laid with his own mason's hammers was holding the whole weight of the house straight and true. By 10 o'clock, the buggy from Blackwood Ridge came over the rise. Sheriff Dutton was driving, his old Winchester resting quiet in the leather boot beneath the seat. He didn't come with his hand on his belt today. He pulled the horses to a halt by the 3-wide hat and wiped his forehead with a blue handkerchief. "The federal judge signed the papers in Denver on Tuesday, Jesse," Dutton said. His voice was still gravel, rough, but it didn't have the iron edge it carried back in November. "Jedediah Holt S. going to the penitentiary for 5 years. The territory marshals found 4 more crates of altered deeds in the bank cellar." Every family from here to the Durango line is getting their title back." Jesse nodded once, not stopping the rhythm of his rag on the horse flank. "He used the until the lead caught up with him," Jesse said. "The town's changed its mind about you, Vance." The sheriff continued. "Sam Reeves printed the whole story about the Durango business endeavor papers. Folks are saying you a hero for standing by the school mistress." Jesse stopped the rag. He looked up at the old lawman, his gray eyes steady under his hat brim. "I ain't a hero, Dutton," Jesse said, his voice flat as a pine board. "I'm just a man who drove his stakes into the dirt and didn't let a banker move 'em. Sutokam Sahoy's social empathy is what the town's discovering now, I reckon. It's easy for folks to look at a man's scar and call him a devil when the weather's fair. But when the storm hits, they find out that the man they called a monster is the only one who knows how to keep the fire burning for a stranger. The community only learns the value of a human soul when they see what happened when you try to freeze it out." Dutton looked at the cabin, then at the wide glass window Jesse had set in the eastern wall. "I reckon you're right, Jesse. The law's a clumsy tool. It don't see the heart until the blood's already on the floor." He shook the reins, turning the buggy back toward the main road. "You need anything from the store, you tell the deputy. The town owes you a ledger." Jesse watched the buggy disappear down the draw. He didn't need anything from the store. He had 30 logs of dry oak stacked against the lean-to, a barrel of salt pork in the cellar, and a sack of white flour that didn't have Holt's bank stamp on the canvas. He walked inside the cabin, his boots quiet on the smooth pine floorboards. The eastern room was wide and full of yellow morning light. Clara had set up 4 long benches made of split spruce, their tops sanded down until the grain looked like silk. At the front of the room hung a wide slate board she had brought from Missouri, its brack surface waiting for the chalk. Sam was sitting on the first bench. He had a small wooden block in his hands, one of the pieces Jesse had cut for him during the winter nights. The boy wasn't looking at the letters today. He was looking out the wide window at a young bay colt that was trotting through the bunch grass by the creek. Clara came out of the kitchen, her apron clean, her acorns and honey hair pinned up in that neat tight bun. She had a piece of white chalk in her fingers. She stopped when she saw Jesse standing in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light from the parlor. "The children from the gulch are coming up the road, Jesse," she said. Her voice had that clear bell-like ring that always made his pulse jump just a fraction. "6 of them. Even the Miller S. boys are coming. Their father said he wants them to read out how the railroad lay there." Be what Jesse walked over to the slate board. He reached out his big rough hand, his thumb tracing the smooth, cool edge of the stone frame. "Education is a form of liberation, Clara," he said verbally, his voice deep and echoing in the clean room. "A man who don't know his letters is always living under another man's shadow. He has to trust that the ink on the paper is telling the truth. And on the frontier, the ink usually belongs to the man who wants the land. When you teach a child to read, you re-giving him a shield. You are giving him the right to stand up before a judge or a banker and say, 'This ground is mine and you ain't got the signature to take it.' That's what changes a territory into a home." Clara looked at him, her gray eyes filling with a soft, warm light that made the silver scar on his neck feel like nothing at all. She stepped closer to him, her fingers reaching up to touch the collar of his wool shirt. "You're an eloquent man when you choose to speak, Jesse Vance," she whispered. "I had a good teacher, ma'am," he said. Sam stood up from the bench. He didn't drop his wooden block. He walked over to Jesse, his small leather shoes making a light tapping sound on the floor. He didn't look up at his mother. He looked straight into Jesse's face, his dark eyes clear and entirely free of the old saint. He reached out and took hold of Jesse's big index finger, his grip tight and warm. The colt's thirsty mouth soothed. The words came out. They didn't have the raw, breaking roar of that day on the flat walk. It was just a boy voice, quiet and regular, speaking to a father before the war started. Jessin to his father before work started, until couldn't get a full breath of the pine air. He didn't say anything to the boy. He just knelt down in the light, took his hat off, and set it on the spruce bench. He picked up his pocket knife, took a fresh piece of cedar from his vest, and handed it to Sam along with the knife. He didn't tell the boy to be careful. He didn't tell him how to hold the wood. He just watched the boy's small thumb find the grain, his actions showing the lad how to shave the cedar clean without nicking the skin. It was an old lesson, a frontier lesson, passed from one McCoy to another without a single ink line being wasted. "We water him together, son," Jesse said after a minute. Sam nodded once, his small jaw setting in that same boom-bing line that Clara had when she looked at the mountains. He tucked the cedar block into his pocket and walked out toward the creek, his stride long and sure as he followed, the horse tracks in the soft mud. Clara stood by the slate board, her hand resting against her apron as she watched them through the glass. The children from the gulch were coming over the rise now, their boots splashing through the clear snowmelt, their voices carrying across the valley like the sound of red-winged blackbirds returning to the willows. Jessie walked out onto the porch, standing beside her as the morning sun hit the peaks, turning the white granite into a wall of pure, blinding gold. He reached down and found her hand, his rough, scarred fingers wrapping around hers, locking together like the notches on a well-built cabin wall. The frontier was still wide, and the wind off the peaks would blow cold again before the year was out. But as Jesse Vance looked down at the children gathering under the ancient oaks, he knew the winter had done its work. The wood was straight, the stone was set, and the house they had built together was going to stand for a long, long time. The characters, settings, and events portrayed in this story are entirely fictional. While certain themes may echo real-life experiences, they are shaped by creative interpretation. The author does not intend to represent or depict any specific individual, organization, or historical event.
When the last snow melts beneath the San Juan peaks and the sound of children's voices rises around that little cabin schoolhouse, this story leaves us with a truth as old and hard as the frontier itself. A man is not defined by the name the world gives him, but by what he chooses to protect when no one is watching. Jesse Vance was called a devil because the town found it easier to believe a scar than to search for the truth behind it. Clara Sterling was judged as weak because she was a widow without money, property, or a man's name to shield her, and her children were nearly turned into evidence in someone else's cruel legal game. Yet in the coldest winter, when the law bent toward the rich and the powerful, these broken people found something stronger than fear. They found courage. They found voice. They found the kind of family that is not written in bloodlines or bank ledgers, but built by sacrifice, loyalty, and love. Jesse teaches us that redemption does not always come with grand speeches. Sometimes it comes in the form of a man giving up his coat in a blizzard, standing guard over a roofless cabin, learning to write his own name, and choosing to become more than the monster others claimed he was. Clara teaches us that education is not a luxury. It is freedom. A person who can read the contract, understand the law, and speak the truth cannot be so easily robbed of land, children, or dignity. Her schoolhouse becomes more than a building. It becomes a lantern for every child who might otherwise grow up trapped beneath another man's ink. And little Sam reminds us that even the quietest heart still has a voice, waiting for the moment when speaking becomes an act of bravery. In the end, this story is not only about surviving the winter, it is about what winter reveals. Hard times strip away every false face. They show us who comes to take, who comes to control, and who comes to build. The frontier may be cold, unjust, and unforgiving, but it also gives good people a chance to drive their stakes into the soil and say, "Here is where kindness will stand." Jesse and Clara did not simply win back land. They built a home where truth mattered, where children were protected, where learning became a shield, and where love was not possession, but freedom. And that is the message we carry with us. The world may try to freeze out the wounded, the poor, and the misunderstood. But one brave hand, one honest voice, and one warm fire can change the whole valley.